You're listening to the Monster Sci-Fi Show.
Hello and welcome once again, Monster Sci-Fi Show fans, to another Monster Sci-Fi Show podcast. Today with me is my first guest on the Monster Sci-Fi Show, which I did, I believe, back in episode 4 a couple of years ago, Robert Venditti of the graphic novel, The Surrogates, and he is with me today. So, Robert, thank you very much for joining me today, sir.
No, thanks for having me on, Monty. I appreciate it.
So what's great about Robert is that I've known Robert since, I think, 99. That we both worked at Winter Park Borders.
Yeah, it might have been even, it might have been 98, actually, even. Yeah. I'm trying to remember when that store opened, but, yeah, 98, 99 for sure.
Yeah, most definitely. Because I remember I was there for the turn of the century, but I get the dates kind of confused. But it was kind of interesting how, so far everyone that's been on my show has at least has some kind of Borders connection to the Monster Sci-Fi Show. So, and I'm really glad of you, of all people, that you were able to get this success for the graphic novel, on top of the fact that it's being made into a movie with Bruce Willis.
Yeah, thanks, man. I appreciate that.
Basically what I wanted to talk about, because after I left Borders, we kind of lost touch, but you had moved to Atlanta.
Yep.
And you came across Top Shelf Comics, so I want you to discuss briefly how that happened.
Yeah. When I was working back at that Winter Park Borders, I was also going to grad school at UCF, University of Central Florida in Orlando, for creative writing. And I wanted to be a prose writer, was sort of my original ambition. And I had never read comics before growing up or anything like that, but another guy named Marcus that, of course, that we also worked with at Borders, a good friend of mine, he sort of prodded me into reading comics and got me to read Astro City, specifically the Confessor story arc. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but when I read that, it immediately struck me sort of the complexity of the medium and the visual aspect of it, all the misguided preconceptions I had that a lot of people were having back then, and certainly for, I guess, decades, that comics were just for kids and things like that. I realized how wrong all of that is. Comics are much more of an established, respected art form now than they were even 10 years ago. So I decided I wanted to write comics, and I ended up moving to Atlanta, and I was just trying to look for a way to get into the industry somehow and didn't really know how to go about doing it. If you want to do something in the arts, if you want to be a musician or a writer or painter or whatever, it's not like you can go apply for that job, I'm going to apply for the job as a novel writer. Will you hire me? That's not really how it works, So how was I going to go ahead and get in the industry? And there was a publisher here locally called Top Shelf Productions, kind of a smaller indie art house publisher then. They've gone on to a lot of great success in the past decade, but back in 2002 when this was, they were still kind of a growing company, but not as well known as they are now. I just emailed them and asked them if they needed any help and offered to volunteer my time, do whatever it was, they needed me to do, because I was just trying to meet people who were in the industry and get around like-minded people and make some connections with people I could ask questions with and talk about my ideas with and things like that. And it turned out that they did need some help, and he needed help actually packing orders in the mailroom. And he asked me if I'd be willing to do that. And by this time, I'd been in the inventory room at Borders for a while, and I knew how to handle a tape gun and all those kinds of things. So I was like, yeah, no problem, I can do that. And so I went and volunteered for him, and it quickly turned into a part-time job that I added on to the full-time job I already had at a Borders up here in suburban Atlanta. So I held down the 2 jobs for a while, and that was kind of how I got hooked up with Top Shelf.
Okay. Because as you were talking about before in a previous interview, that you came up with the idea. Who was the first person that you talked to or showed this idea about the Surrogates to?
The very first person I ever talked to was my wife. And I just told her I had this idea and, what did she think about it? And she thought it sounded kind of silly. But, in her defense, I'm a horrible verbal pitch man. I'm just terrible at it. If somebody, an editor or agent or whoever, what are you working on, and it's at a stage where I haven't written it yet, and I'm
right.
and they want me to give them a pitch. I'm terrible at it, it's just horrible. So
I
probably
know the feeling.
Yeah, so I probably didn't do the story justice, because when I finished the script for the first chapter and I let her read that, she was like, wow, I understand what it is now, and this is a really cool idea. But so my wife was the first person that I ever talked to or showed anything, but after that, it would be Chris Staros, the editor at Top Shelf, and he and I would just sort of talk about things in the car while we were driving to conventions to go to comic book shows and all that kind of stuff, and he would just sort of drill me with a bunch of questions. I told him what my idea for the Surrogates was, and he thought it was an interesting idea, and he would just ask me a bunch of questions, ask me, and trying to probe and see how much I had really thought about the story and these characters and this plot and all those kinds of things. And all these questions he kept asking me were questions I already knew the answers to. They were things that I'd thought about and things that I'd already planned on including in the story. And, he was trying to trip me up, but I had already, written enough notes and sketched it out enough that I kind of had a lot of that stuff figured out. So a lot of the editing that we did, really because of my relationship with Chris and us being friends and spending a lot of time in the car and me working for him, a lot of that stuff was done verbally in a lot of ways, as opposed to me turning in batches of script to him, which I did as well, but by the time I turned something into him, he kind of already knew everything that was going on because I'd already told him all about it. So it was kind of a mixture of script and discussion, I guess.
When it comes to Brett, who actually became the actual artist for your book, was his name the first person you thought of, or how did you vet Brett to be the person?
Yeah, no, I didn't know who Brett was, and that's not because he hadn't done a lot of work, because he had. It was just because of my general ignorance of the industry, and having come into comics so late, I wouldn't have known any artists or writers if you had said their names to me. I stumbled upon Alan Moore, not because I heard about him and he was some great writer and I knew that he had done Watchmen and From Hell and those kinds of things. I started reading Alan Moore because when I started reading comics, I wanted to start off with a new company, so I wasn't bogged down in all this continuity. And at that time, the ABC line had just started up. And I went to the comic book shop, and there was Tom Strong #1 there, and I was like, okay, this looks cool. I'll buy this. It's a #1, and I liked it, and so I went and bought Top 10 and Tomorrow Stories and the other ABC line that Alan Moore was writing, and I was like, wow, this Alan Moore guy's pretty good. I wonder what else he's done. Oh, he's done Watchmen? What's that? Let me go see what that is. So I was really very, very ignorant of who the people were in the industry. So I got hooked up with Brett through Chris. Chris has and still does do a lot of editor days for Savannah College of Art and Design, which is a art school here in Savannah, Georgia, that also has a sequential art program. So they have a lot of comics artists there in the school, learning to draw specifically for comics. And so he goes over there for editors days. And Brett Welderly was a SCAD student, and Chris had remembered his portfolio and talking with him at one of those editor days, and Brett had since graduated and gone on to do stuff with Brian Wood and Anthony Johnson and other guys like that, but Chris remembered his style and called him up and asked him if he'd be willing to do it. And when I saw his style, I felt like it was a really good match for the story because it has this sort of sketchiness to it, sort of frenetic aspect to it that I think fits in well with the cyberpunk style overtones of the story. So
after this time, you had the first 5 books that were published. And I remember on the back of those comics, you had an actual marketing campaign for the books.
Yeah.
Whose idea was that? Was that Chris's or yours?
Yeah, all the backup material and all those kinds of things were ideas that I had, but I didn't even write them out. I did the full script, but I didn't write those supplemental things out because I knew they would take a lot of work. But they were just thoughts that I had of things I wanted to do, but I didn't know if I would get to do them because not knowing as I was writing this that Top Shelf was going to be the publisher, because the original idea was that I would talk it through with Chris and he would read the script and introduce me to people that might want to do it. So I kind of broke it up in these 24-page chunks because a typical comic is 32 pages, and I figured, okay, depending on who the company is I go with, that'll leave them with 8 pages for ads, and I was trying to do all these kinds of things to make it as easy of a situation for a publisher to buy into as possible.
Right.
So I knew that if I had the chance to do those supplements, I would want to do them, but I didn't bank on doing them. It wasn't until Top Shelf decided to sign the book that I knew there weren't going to be any ads, and then I could do those supplements. And so that left the back cover open, which is usually prime advertising space. One of the supplements I already had wanted to do was the brochure that was at the back of the 4th issue, where if you went into a dealership to buy your surrogate, here's all the option packages you have and those kinds of things,
right,
like going to a car dealership. And so I already had that idea, but when we were working with the graphic designer, Jim Titus, who designs all those supplements and the ads and all those kinds of things, designs all the books, he does an amazing job. He was sort of like-minded with me, and he said, what if we do an ad campaign? And I said, yeah, I already had these brochures I wanted to do, and so we talked about doing the ad campaign, and I sort of concepted it out as far as the rotating share yourself, dare yourself, enjoy yourself taglines, in the share yourself one, I want, two lovers holding each other, and I sort of concepted that stuff out. But he went and got the ads and designed the logo and built all those ads. So it was a real collaborative process with me working with Jim, and it was really fun. I mean, it was just a cool thing. And I mean, viral marketing sounds so quaint now, I mean,
no, I know, but back then, it made perfect sense to do that.
Yeah, this was 2005 when the book came out. We had started doing those ads probably as early as 2004, It was funny because we had already started working on those ads, and I had already written out all the supplements, and the book was really far into production when I went to the movie theater to see, I don't know what it was, probably Lord of the Rings movie or something back when they were coming out, and I saw the ads for the iRobot movie. They had these fake ads up about the robots,
Yeah.
And I was like, man, because I was already working on something like that as well. And that's the first time I remember seeing a viral marketing thing like that was those iRobot ads. So,
right.
Publishing lag time being what it is, we were working on it before that, but they beat us to the punch as far as actually getting it out into the public,
Of course. Now, from that point on, how soon after did John Mostow, who is now the director of the Surrogates, when did he contact you to do this as now a actual film?
Yeah, I didn't ever actually speak with him during that phase.
Oh. Okay.
That was all done by the producer, and basically the producer who sort of got the ball rolling was a guy named Max Handelman, and his wife is Elizabeth Banks, the actress she was in Zack and Miri, and she's in the Spider-Man movies, and she was in Seabiscuit, a lot of different things. And he contacted me out of the blue and was interested in the film rights, and he just seemed like a real down-to-earth, regular guy, and I just liked him personally. We sort of hit it off as far as this was a guy who was the same age as me, a lot of the same ideas about things, and he just seemed like somebody that I could work with and was always going to be a straight shooter. I certainly don't want to generalize all the Hollywood producers, but there are definitely
right.
a faction of them that are always blowing, smoke up your skirt and all those kinds of things. So I decided, that we wanted to go ahead and go with Max. He ended up bringing in a couple of other producers from Mandeville Films, who is a big production company that has their first look deal at Disney. And the three of them got together and put their package together before they brought it to the studio. So they went and got Mostow and the screenwriters and then went to Disney with that team already in place and pitched it as a package deal. Here's the material. Here's who the director's going to be. Here's who the screenwriters are going to be. This is what their idea is for the movie and marketing and those kinds of things. And it was after the deal was signed and all that kind of stuff. It was after that point that I finally talked to Mostow, because there really is no need for him to talk to me at that point. If the studio's not going to buy it, then he doesn't even need to talk to me because it's not going to happen.
There's no point, yeah. Okay, well, for those who are not familiar with the Surrogates graphic novel, what is it in a nutshell? How best would you describe it?
Yeah, the basic idea is that a surrogate is an android representation of yourself that you send out into the world, and you're linked to it virtually, so you experience everything it does, and you control all of its movements through thought in real time, and it's living its life for you in your place. So in the future world of the Surrogates, the majority of the population are living through these machines, but for various reasons. Some people have them because of the obvious sort of personal appearance aspect. They want to look differently, they want to look more attractive, those kinds of things. Other people might have them just for utilitarian reasons. Their job is dangerous, and they don't want to get hurt while they're doing their job. Or other people want to summit Mount Everest or whatever, and they don't have the physical ability to do that, so they do it through the machine. And so everybody's living through these machines with each other. And the idea for me was spawned by looking at culture back in 2002, and there were two things going on at the same time. One was the way that chat rooms and gaming and these kinds of things were providing a venue for people to create these idealized personas for themselves in the machine, where you could do what you want in a chat room and in a game room, and whatever it is you say you are, that's what you are. Nobody's looking at you, nobody's dealing with you. You can sort of reinvent yourself in that way. And so the problem with that is this persona you create is necessarily bound to the computer. So my thought was, what if a technology existed where you could create this identity for yourself, and it could go out into the world and do the things that you need to do to live, go to work, take the kids to school, buy groceries, all that kind of stuff. Then you could be that persona all the time. And coupled with that was also this sort of rise of plastic surgery and these radical plastic surgery TV shows like Extreme Makeover and Dr. 90210, and this sort of desire to use science to provide beauty on demand. And so those were kind of the two things that were working together that sparked the idea for me.
Now, in keeping with this Surrogates idea, your newest book, which is called Flesh and Bones, I believe takes place 15 years prior to the events in the current graphic novel, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. So what are the details with that?
Yeah, and if you've read the first book, the Flesh and Bone actually tells the story of the first riots that you learn all about in the supplement at the end of Chapter 3 in the first Surrogates book. So really it was this situation where I had to go back and take a story that everybody knew what the ending was and still spin it in a way that would be suspenseful and keep the reader engaged. And so it's set 15 years before the first book, and it basically, in the first book, you have surrogate culture is already very pervasive, and everybody in the city is already living through the machines, and you have the people that object to the machines who live on their own reservation outside the city, but everybody in the city is pretty much a surrogate. In the book Flesh and Bone that's set 15 years before that, it's still a city where you don't know if you're standing next to a surrogate or a person in the crowd or whatever. So the city is going through a lot of these growing pains as the technology is gaining popularity. The people that don't want to use surrogates or can't afford to use surrogates are going to, they're starting to get more alienated, and so there's tensions there. And you also see sort of the origins of a lot of the characters. You see Harvey's wife bring her surrogate home for the first time, and the effect surrogate technology has had on their marriage is a big underpinning of the first book. And you see the prophet, who's the leader of the anti-surrogate movement, starting up his church, and so it sort of shows you all these things as they were first happening.
Now, in our last conversation, I think it was back in 2007 or so, you mentioned that this was going to be an actual third book in the process. Has that been taking shape and form yet, or that's still...
No, we just got the Flesh and Bone out there. Gosh, I don't even think it's been a month yet. So I've got some other projects I'm working on, and I'm certainly going to go back and do that third book. But I'm actually up to 5 books now that I want to do.
Okay.
Yeah, I originally envisioned it as a trilogy. The first book, the prequel, and then a sequel that comes after the first book. So kind of did the Star Wars thing where I did the middle, then the beginning, and now I went to the end. If that didn't confuse everybody enough,
Good example to go with.
Yeah, but I want to do 2 more books between the prequel and the first book as well. So I'm up to 5 now, and it's just sort of this. It's a general idea that lends itself to a lot of stories. So it's something that I hope to come back to and do for a long time down the road. But I'll be doing other projects in between them instead of just doing surrogates, constantly.
Okay. Well, let's move on to some questions. I've been Twittering my butt off to see if there's any people who are really interested in, who cannot attend, but they want to have some questions answered. Let's go ahead, and the first one is from S. Ardent.
Okay.
He mentions, referring to you, do you see any similarity between your graphic novel and David Brin's, I guess it's pronounced Killing People?
Yeah, I think that's Killing People.
Killing People. Okay.
Yeah. Is he in the discussion right now, or he just sent this question to you through Twitter?
No, that was it through Twitter.
Okay. Yeah, it's funny. I'm not a big sci-fi guy. I've read maybe 10 sci-fi novels in my entire life, and a lot of them were all for one class I took when I was at UCF. I didn't know what Killing People was. The first time I heard of it was after the book was in print, and I was talking to somebody at the booth at a convention, and they had come by, and people come by and, what's your book about? And you give them your pitch and all those kinds of things. And this guy said, that sounds like Killing People. And I said, I don't know what Killing People is. that was the first time I'd heard of it, So I've not read Killing People. I don't know really what Killing People is about. So I don't know. I mean, I will say, though, that I never thought from the beginning this idea I had of people living through other people remotely was new. I mean, in the entire history of the written word, I doubt there's any ideas that are really new at that point. So as a writer, I don't really try to worry about that kind of stuff so much. Is you really want to imbue the story with characters that come from within you and that are original to you, and that's what makes all the war stories different from each other. And every story that's about time travel is about time travel, so they're similar, but they're all very different in how they handle it and what their characters are and things like that. So, Yeah, I mean, and if you just look at things right now, just in the past few years, it really seems like sometimes there's just an idea that happens at the same moment, and it's like a critical mass, and the idea happens. And it's happened a few times that I remember. There was Ed TV and the Truman Show happened at the same exact time, same identical kind of idea, because it was just an idea that was there. Right now, I mean, there's the Surrogates. There was another movie somebody told me about called Cyberceros that came out. It was like an independent film, and it's about immigrants working in the United States, but instead of actually having to come here to work, they're working through machines in fields. You've got that movie Gamer coming out, which isn't robots, but it's still remote controlled sort of kind of idea. So there's a lot of that stuff going around. I think it's just technology has advanced to the point where this is just going to be a staple.
The second question comes from Comics Report. He wanted to know, how do you come up with your ideas and what's your inspiration?
Yeah, the idea for the Surrogates I got from reading a book in college. There was actually a study that a guy did of people addicted to the internet, and they would lose their jobs and get divorced and that kind of stuff because they were maintaining this persona in the machine. And that's what sort of got me thinking about what if you could take it out of the machine and put it in the real world so that you could go to your job and that kind of stuff. But really, it's hard to really put your finger on where ideas come from. I mean, they're just suddenly there all of a sudden, and you don't even know why they're there. They're just there. But I do try to I don't even read a lot of fiction, honestly. I don't read a lot of novels. I read a lot of nonfiction, magazines, just books about whatever. And I think that just putting your mind out there and exposing yourself to as much input as possible, you end up getting these ideas like plastic surgery and the internet. What if those things came together and boom, there's a Surrogates, So the more stuff you expose yourself to, I think the more stew that's ingredients in the pot, eventually you're going to come up with a stew,
Okay, cool. I have actually two questions. You kind of touched on one of them, but we'll touch it in just a moment. It's built by Bosch. His question is, what do you think about the new film? Have you gotten to see it? Any rough cuts?
I haven't seen any rough cuts, but that's because I don't want to see any rough cuts, I've read the screenplay, I've visited the set, I've seen dailies, all that kind of stuff, but I just, I'm not a Hollywood veteran. I wouldn't know by watching a rough cut where the cameraman is sneezing off camera and there's wires attached to everybody. I wouldn't be able to visualize what that finished product is going to look like, and I think it would probably scare me more than anything else, So I don't want to see it. I want to see it when it's finished, which hopefully should be pretty soon. Okay,
that's fair enough. Now, the other question he had was, why aren't comics considered an art form? You briefly touched on that, earlier in the conversation.
Yeah, I think that comics have grown a lot, and I think in a lot of circles they are considered an art form now. I think that, certainly with older generations, maybe our parents and our grandparents, they probably still think of them as kid stuff, but our generation and younger, I think comics are really on everybody's radar now. And a big reflection of that is sort of the inroads they've made into colleges and universities. The literati and the professors and the educators at the universities, they're bringing comics into their curriculum, not only to teach classes about comics literature, but to just bring a graphic novel into a class that's about something else that isn't even comics. I actually got an email today, coincidentally, from a guy I used to work at another Borders with who's a senior in college. He's taken a class called Cyborgs in America, and the first day that he was in the class, the professor started talking about the Surrogates, And it's not a class that's about comics, It's just a class about the concept of cyborgs in America and robotics and all that kind of stuff. But the graphic novel is something that's become part of the course now. So I do think they're considered and respected as an art form much more now than they used to be. And another evidence of that would be, it's been a couple months, but very recently the New York Times actually started putting a graphic novel bestsellers in their bestseller lists every week now. So they're definitely on everybody's radar at this point.
We haven't discussed it before, but you think that the somewhat hype of the Watchmen graphic novel being made into a movie played a key into that, being that it's an older graphic novel for over 20 years?
I don't know. I think it was kind of happening before that. I think a lot of it really has been buoyed up by a lot of the non-Marvel DC stuff. I mean, obviously those things are very big, and Free Comic Book Day is always pinned around some release of a major movie like a Spider-Man or a Wolverine or whatever to try to get people into the stores to buy Marvel and DC stuff. But a lot of the stuff that's going on at the universities and a lot of the reviews you see in places like New Yorker or the New York Times and things like that, they're all like the small indie press, more literary style of comics, which is really the stuff that Top Shelf does more traditionally. I think it's that kind of stuff that has really helped it get noticed as an art form. Now, if you're talking about having comics in people's mindset as an instrument of pop culture, then yeah, it's definitely going to link back to stuff like the Watchmen movie and, really all the comic book movies that have come out to this point that are the big Marvel characters and stuff like Iron Man and all that. So I think it's a bit of both.
All right, our next question is from Dave Fazio, and his question is, can you explain your idea behind the gender other surrogates?
In one of the supplements at the end of Chapter 1, to really sort of flesh out the world and really sort of give people an idea of how much this technology had changed this future setting, I had a fake scholarly article written by a fake professor where he's talking about that kind of stuff, and he talks about how surrogates have affected three main areas of society. One was law enforcement and crime, another was public health, and the third one was race and gender relations. And it was just sort of this idea that I came up with where I remember hearing at some point about the relatively low number of female commercial airline pilots. There just aren't that many that do the job. And it was, I don't remember where I read this, so I can't cite it for you, but there was a lot of talk in there about there being gender bias, and that's why there were so little of them, because certainly there are more women that want to be pilots. So why is the percentage so low? And so it just got me thinking about that. Like, what if a woman wanted to be an airline pilot, which is a really good paying job, and these guys make really good money. And so to do that, in order to get hired, she went and got a male surrogate to go do that job. What would that do to stereotypes and gender bias? And in this sort of weird way, even though it's upholding the stereotype, because the woman is now forced to, do her job as a man in order to gain acceptance, that's a stereotype. But in a weird way, the stereotype is also being broken down because the woman is getting the job. So at the same time, in this weird way, it upholds and lessens racial and gender bias. And so that was kind of my idea, that people would not just use surrogates just to be themselves. They would use them to change identities for professional reasons, maybe for romantic reasons, any of these kinds of things. And so that was something that is a big part of the Internet, like I was saying before, is in redefining your identity. It's not like everybody's on there saying they are who they are, except they're just hotter, check out my pic. I mean, their ages are different, genders are different, all these kinds of things. And so that's kind of what I was going for with that.
My last question, this is actually something I just found out. MTV Splash page posted something about this, and I had a fit about this, and it's tying into this question about Steeplejack.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Jonathan Lasalle decided, for whatever reason, not to name that character in this movie. Now, I'm not saying that it's on the level of not seeing the squid in the Watchmen movie, but, the squid I can live without because I understand it doesn't fit. But, the character of Steeplejack is pretty much, you see him in the very beginning of the book, and you cannot just ignore that. And I'm just curious, how do you feel about that direction?
Yeah, I knew about this very early on in the process. Before I even read the screenplay, I knew that Steeplejack wasn't going to be in the movie. And I was like you, I was a little miffed at first, but then when it was explained to me, it actually made rational sense to me. The movie's set much more in the near future, so it's much more of a here and now, which makes sense because when I was writing the story in 2002 and I said it in 2054, the technology has come along so far since then that it seems like this technology is going to be available much sooner than that. There was a featurette that came out on Wired.com a week or two ago that details all of the things technology is already doing that are going to bring about the world of the surrogates, where you can already operate robots just by thought and all that kind of stuff. So it makes sense to have it set more in the near future. I don't have a problem with that. And because the movie is so grounded in the here and now, and I can respect this. You know, there are things that you can do in a comic book that work well that I don't think work as well on a film. So, for example, a character like Steeplejack, who's very much sort of a superhero/villain trope of character. He swings around from the rooftops, and he's got electricity shooting out of his hands and all these kinds of things. He's superpowered to some extent. It works well in a comic book, but when you see that on a film, for me as a viewer, it takes you out of the realism of the moment. You know, even when I go see movies that are very good, comic book movies like Spider-Man or Dark Knight, you know, that kind of stuff, those movies are great movies, and the stories are good. The actors play the characters well, but I still don't buy into it where I feel like Gotham City is something that's actually happening in my world. Because when you get down to it, you got these guys in costumes running around, and it just doesn't seem to I don't know, it breaks it down for me. And so I think that's kind of what they were thinking when they took the Steeplejack character, who the events that Steeplejack does still happen just by another person. He just doesn't have the powers and the electricity shooting out of his hands and all that kind of stuff that Steeplejack does. It makes sense in that context because I think that as a viewer, and I can relate to this, it would break down some of the realism that they're going for.
Fair enough. Now, on that note, we know that, of course, Watchmen had a motion comic feature, and I'm wondering, are there any plans for the Surrogates to follow that kind of route?
Yeah, I haven't. I don't even. It's funny you mention this because I'm so behind the times technologically. I just got my website up like a week ago. You know, the first website I've ever had. I finally got robertvenditti.com up like a week ago, and today's post was about iTunes Comics and Motions Comics. That's what I talked about. Haven't seen the Watchmen motion comic. I've seen motion comics in early demos when people were first trying to get iTunes stuff off the ground. It doesn't really appeal to me, you know. To me, it's not really a comic anymore. I mean, they look good and they're cool, but I don't know why they call them comics. It's more like an animated movie to me. I mean, the idea of comics to me is all about static images, you know, either standing alone or in sequence, but the images are static, and it's the ability to just look at that moment and have a freeze frame and stare at it is what gives comics its strength as a medium. So I do have iTunes apps and things like that are going to be coming out, but they're one of the readers. It's more of a static style of reader. They don't have word balloons growing out of people's mouths or effects or, you know, any kind of things like that. It's just a comic that you flip through the panels and you read it, and they're static images. So those should be available on iTunes, you know, the iTunes apps of the Surrogates, I don't know, probably within the next couple of weeks, but I don't think there's going to be any motion comics or anything like that.
Well, Robert, you know, I thank you once again for taking the time out to discuss with me, you know, this great movie. I'm dying to see this, and I hope everyone else will not only just see this, but also read your graphic novel. I
appreciate that, man. Thanks for having me on, Monty. This is the first, I've done a lot of podcasts. This is the first one I've done where you thought ahead to do Twitter and get questions from people. That's a really neat idea. I don't know if a lot of people are doing that, but that's a good idea to get people involved in the show and sort of a live kind of thing. So kudos to you on that one.
Oh, well, thank you, sir. I mean, I try to do as much work as I can because it means a lot to me to, I mean, Scifi being a friend to me, it was just more of respect for the work you've done. So I really thank you for that.
I appreciate that, man.
All right, man. So we'll stay in touch, and Monster Sci-Fi Show fans, go out there and get your comics. And for those who posted their questions, I will be contacting one of you for an actual signed graphic novel by Robert Venditti himself. So, Monster Sci-Fi Show fans, I am signing off, and stay geeky, everyone.